Ladies and gentlemen, good evening on what is a chilly Sydney evening. Thank you for coming out to join us this evening for what's going to be a wonderful session. My name is Martin Fahey. I'm the CEO of the Ramsay Centre, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here this evening. The format, as usual, I'll do a brief introduction to our two speakers this evening. Ian Frazer will speak for about 40 minutes. We'll then have a fireside discussion, which Nick Enfield will facilitate, and then we'll open it up to the floor for about 20 minutes of questions, and there are roving mics available. And then we can allow you to finish the evening in each other's company outside again. This event continues our foray into looking at issues of contemporary science in the context of Western civilization. While philosophy, history, literature, art may bring wonderful meaning to our lives, our day-to-day lives have been improved imaginably. I think the lives we live today, the improvements that have been in our quality of life in terms of longevity, infant mortality, and being freed from the scourge of poor diet, early childhood mortality, all of those things. I think even going back 60, 70 years, people would be amazed at the progress that we've made. And that progress, I think, is hugely important as we look back across the millennia to those epistemological, challenges that we've faced and epistemological ideas that shape reason, evidence, and how we deliver good outcomes for society from curiosity and good scientific inquiry. This is not possible, though, without the generosity of our donor, Paul Ramsay. His bequest has allowed us to facilitate these events, to bring a cohort of international and national speakers, and to explore these topics in an informed, intelligent, civil manner in the public square. And many of the issues that our speakers are going to address tonight are quite to the forefront of public debate, public policy changes that are emerging from the US, declining vaccine rates, increasing healthcare costs, debate about pharmaceutical costs, debate about IP and pharmacy, funding of science, and Australia's policy in terms of funding of science are all issues that will play out in the coming decades. But to the speakers for tonight, it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Ian Frazer, a clinical scientist trained as a clinical immunologist in Scotland. He is professor at the University of Queensland, where he leads the research group in the Translational Research Institute, and most of that works on the immunobiology of epithelial cancers. But most people, if you go out and ask most people about him, they'll refer to his amazing work with his team in the area of HPV, and in particular, the co-inventor of the technology enabling HPV vaccines. They have been absolutely life-changing in terms of the incidence of cervical cancer. And I think, are probably the standout development that we've seen emerge in that space. He continues to work on new vaccine technologies in his role as a board member of a number of companies and is a board member of several not-for-profit. He was the inaugural president of the Australian Academy of Health and Medical Sciences and a member of the Australian National Science and Technology Council. He chairs the Australian Medical Research Advisory Board of the Medical Research Future Fund, which is an element of our Future Fund, which has been set aside for very, very specific purposes. All of those contributions place amazing demands on his time, and he continues to be an active researcher. He continues to make enormous public contributions, but also then generously takes time to engage in, if you like, public service of informing us, of guiding us, and helping us to think about these really, really challenging public policy issues that touch all of our lives. He was recognised as Australian of the Year in 2006. He was recipient of the Prime Minister's Prize for Science and the Balzan Prize in 2008, and was elected Fellow of the Royal Society of London in 2012, and he was appointed Companion of the Order of Australia in the Queen's Birthdays Honours List in 2013. Ladies and gentlemen, Ian Frazer.
Well, good evening, and it's nice to be here with you all. I would like to start by acknowledging that this is NAIDOC Week and recognise the contribution that has been made by First Nations people to the health and welfare of Australia over the years, and their continuing interest in that area. I'd like to thank you for providing me with an opportunity to discuss your chosen topic, which was truth in science and the challenge science faces today. The trouble that I have talking to you this evening is that I'm kind of a one-trick pony. I have only ever done one thing that's made a lot of noise worldwide, and most people have already heard most of the story about the HPV vaccine. So rather than talk about that this evening, although I could do, I'm going to start off by talking about how I got into science, because I think that one of the challenges that we face is to interest our young up-and-coming scientists of the future sufficiently in science to actually get them to sign up for science courses, which are generally harder than the arts ones, although I hope that I'm not offending anybody by saying that too loudly. I was born in Scotland and lived the first 30 years of my life there. When I was 11 years old, I was pretty sure I wanted to be a scientist. My dad was a biochemist, and he seemed to enjoy what he was doing. And that year, he gave me a chemistry set for my Christmas, I think it was. I tried mixing all the ingredients together to see if anything happened. I was rather disappointed when nothing actually did. I was hoping I might get at least a little explosion out of the thing, but it didn't work that way. I suspect it was a safe set designed to be used by 11-year-olds. My dad was still interested in chemistry, and I decided that there must be a more interesting aspect to science than a safe chemistry set. So perhaps prompted by New Scientist, and please, all of you, this is the Bible that you want to be giving to your young kids, because that's where all the answers are. Perhaps prompted by New Scientist, which at that time was distributed free to secondary school science classes, I elected a science track for my high school education in Aberdeen. This was at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, interesting time. So there was a lot of discussion of atom bombs and what they might do if they were used. Aberdeen, where I was educated, was the #1 target for any nuclear war, or so we were told, because they had all of the early warning equipment right on our doorstep. If the missiles came over from Russia, they were going to go to try and destroy the sensory devices that were available around Aberdeen. But to that, I mean, that story was probably a bit oversold. The Aberdeen Press and Journal was rather unreliable as a source of information. I should point out that the Press and Journal, as a source of news, was notorious in other areas as well. It had this wonderful headline, "Aberdeen man dies at sea the day the Titanic sank." And I kind of thought that put it in its place. But partly in response to the Cuban Missile Crisis, I chose to learn Russian as a language at school. I was the only one in the class, but I did have a very good Russian teacher, and he taught me Russian, which fortunately I only had the opportunity to use on a holiday in Russia some years later. I found I could order food in Russian. I also found that the fact that I could do that attracted the interest of the KGB shadows that followed me around. They did rather better on the eating than I did, I must admit, but it was easy to spot them. My first interest in science at high school was in astrophysics, partly because of the discussion on nuclear weapons, but also because I was introduced by my science teacher to an interesting theoretical problem in astrophysics, the so-called three-body problem. The three-body problem basically aimed to define, through equations, the subsequent movement of three objects under the influence of their own gravity. And while it's very easy to work it out for two objects, you can work out exactly what will happen, and the equations will tell you where the two objects will go. For the three objects story, it was not nearly so clear, and I understand that there still isn't really a solution to that problem today. And so if you've got something you want to go out and do there's a little challenge for you. From my point of view, I just wrote an essay on the topic and said it was pretty difficult. or words to that effect. And my interest encouraged my selection of physics as a major for my admission to Edinburgh University when I went on to university. This was at a time that black holes were in the news and Stephen Hawking was making exciting statements about topics that really interested me as a young scientist. But reality set in when I found out that all the jobs prospects in that area of astrophysics and nuclear physics were in Switzerland, where they had the CERN and the atom smashers and could do the experiments. And there really wasn't much chance of me getting there because there was a queue about a mile long of people waiting to try and get into jobs there. So I switched into medicine in the first year that I was at university. And by the time I was 18, if you'd asked me what I was intending to do when I grew up, then the answer would have been that I would wanted to be a doctor in training. And my interest was in kidney medicine and renal medicine because that was the interest that my father had. Now, looking back, as a nearly retired clinician, scientist and company director, I can say that I was fortunate to have the chance to use the skill sets of each of the jobs that I had to help me to produce solutions to the problem of cervical cancer. And cervical cancer, as you're probably aware, is a very common cancer amongst women, killing about 500,000 women worldwide every year, including my maternal grandmother, whom I was very fond of, who died when I was just a teenager. My Edinburgh University career was nevertheless not a standard one, certainly not for a would-be doctor at that time in the late 1960s. I took a course in computer science, which enabled me to think about the three-body problem and to play the game of life, which was at that time very popular, and used up vast amounts of computer CPU time to absolutely no useful purpose whatsoever at all. But it gave me a chance to think about population health issues, which was part of the reason that that program was written. And with that, it helped me to think about how that could be applied to the development of vaccines later in my career. I also made some personal decisions at that time and came to the conclusion that for me at that age, skiing was a far more interesting topic than surgery. So for a couple of years, I spent January running ski trips to Europe for Edinburgh University students and missed out on quite a large part of the surgery training program. This was probably not in my best interests, unfortunately, but it did give me a chance to get on with something which I thought was more useful than for the majority of students. The problems that I got into were more to do with the fact that they noticed I wasn't at work, and it was brought to their attention when I'd actually run a holiday which was supposed to have got 30 students to Switzerland. Unfortunately, 2 of them got on the wrong train in Paris and ended up in Marseille instead of in Switzerland. And they didn't have any documentation with them because I had all the passports. So that the university got a little bit fed up with me at that point, and I think I probably should have decided to let somebody else take over the skiing holidays at least. The net result of not showing up for those first couple of months of the year was that I missed out on the surgery side of things. But I managed to get out of that by 2 tricks. One was I was awarded the surgery medical that year. It was a written exam and I passed it, but obviously got a good score. And the second thing was that when I was supposed to front up to the Dean of Medicine, and these are all true stories, by the way, the Dean of Medicine, to explain why I hadn't turned up for the surgery lectures, the head of the medical course at that time was the professor of psychiatry, and he and I and the Dean of Medicine were supposed to meet up, but unfortunately the meeting was postponed because the day before the professor of psychiatry was in the courts defending a charge of shoplifting. And this is, as I say, it's all true, so that I was saved by his interests and managed to get through the course somehow or other. I actually took a course in the history and philosophy of science. I was actually quite interested in this whole business of how science arose and realized that most of the science in medical practice actually arose not in Western Europe, but rather in the Middle East, where the laws about dissecting bodies were basically nil, unlike the Western world, where it really wasn't thought to be a good thing to do. And therefore I could actually learn how that ability to dissect bodies actually led to a better understanding of disease. I think something that we sometimes forget. At any rate, I eventually emerged generally unscathed from the medical course in Edinburgh, and elected to take my postgraduate training in renal medicine because, again, my father had been very much involved in setting up renal dialysis in Edinburgh at that time. I didn't know that at the time. I only found that out many years later. But when I was finished my training in renal medicine and kidney medicine, I was offered a very safe job as a consultant in renal medicine in Edinburgh. And I was also, at the same time, offered a very risky job as a research scientist in Melbourne, Australia, which I had promised to consider when I'd spent an elective in immunology in Melbourne in the middle of my medical course, and was looked after by the people at the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute. Somewhat against my wife's better judgment, I decided that Melbourne was more interesting than Scotland, and we went out there, my wife being about 4 months pregnant with our first child at that time, and we're going halfway around the world to an uncertain future in Australia. The lab that I went to didn't do much work on renal medicine, so I made a pragmatic decision at that time to find a new area to work in. And my boss at that time, Ian Mackay, worked on liver disease, so I gave that a go for a while. But it was actually a very difficult area to work in, and I went to meet the world experts in that area, Sheila Sherlock in London, Professor Hans Myers Buschenfeld in Heidelberg, and they could both see that perhaps I wasn't as interested in that area as I should be, and that I should choose another subject of interest to fit in with the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute's interest in human immunology. And as luck would have it, I met Harald Surhausen in Germany. Now, Harald Surhausen was working in the same, well, he was the director of the institute where Hans Myers and Buschenfeld was working on liver disease. And I had a cup of coffee with Harald Surhausen. He said, I think you should work on papillomavirus. And he helped me a little bit in that. And he himself discovered that papillomaviruses were found in a number of human and animal cancers at a time when the technology to actually map out what that meant was not actually clear. But over the course of the next few years, his lab showed subsequently that papillomavirus was very much likely responsible for cervical and some other cancers, and indeed he was given the Nobel Prize for Science and Medicine for that discovery. He challenged me to take my interest in human papillomavirus to Melbourne, and I did that, and then up to Brisbane, where I met Dr. Jan Zhu, who I'd met actually in Cambridge some time before, and he and I got together and we decided that we would work on the papillomavirus, and the vaccine came out of all of that. And I mean, that's a story which I'm not going to go into in great detail tonight. I mean, it's been widely publicized and I don't think it's appropriate. Subsequently, through the university, however, we commercialized the HPV vaccine, and that perhaps was another part of a lesson that we had learned, was that it was really important, if you were wanting to get something used, there had to be a way of commercializing it to get it out there. I mean, if you wait you can't do these things yourself. You need a company that's going to be involved. And we were very fortunate that we were able to enroll, first of all, CSL in the area, and then through CSL with Merck and GSK, who eventually became the manufacturers of the vaccines that are now widely available. And as I said, I'm not going to talk about that any much more because it's all well publicized. But I think the important thing to remember is that the challenge with these vaccines has not been the manufacture of them, but rather their use, getting them where they're needed and when they're needed. And we still have this challenge in regard to cervical cancer, that we have to deliver these vaccines on a global basis and to a group of younger women who are not easily contacted through schools or otherwise. They've usually left primary school by that stage, and they don't have any further connection with organised healthcare until somebody thinks about getting a vaccine program going in the country where they are. So that's one of the challenges that we face with all infectious diseases, is not so much the development of the vaccines, although they can be pretty tough, but rather the means to actually distribute them. And this is a much more challenging area, which I think we need to think very seriously about. It's no point in developing a new management strategy for a major health problem and then finding that you can't deliver it. That's still a challenge for most of things. It's worth remembering that the first attempts to prevent infections through immunization were not actually as a consequence of science or of scientific research, but rather with a simple observation made by real people out in the real world, that if you'd been working with cows, you were much less likely to get smallpox than if you hadn't been. And that was not really thought through particularly scientifically, but the use of cowpox to protect people against smallpox turned out to be a win-win situation. The vast majority of people who were deliberately exposed to cowpox in the 16th and 17th century did not get the smallpox. They were not worried about whether it killed them. They were worried about the disfigurement that came from the smallpox infections, and these were quite effectively prevented by using material from cowpox lesions. And now, of course, we've used that knowledge to eliminate smallpox from this planet. We no longer have it to worry about. It was declared dead and gone by the WHO about 45 years ago. And because it really only infects humans, it won't come back. So I was thinking about what the topic that I was really asked to address was. I think that I can only reinforce the idea that the scientific method is the appropriate approach to make good use of science. In other words, we need to link causality with what happens as a consequence of what we do. And we really need to try and make sure that people understand that science is the way that we gather knowledge that helps us control a whole range of problems that we face in society today. On the wall, I'll remind myself of this and then you as well, that there's just inside the door of the Royal Society in London, there's a little motto on the wall, written on the wall. It says, nullius in verba, or if you translate that, it means take nobody's word for it. In other words, get out and do the science yourself. Don't assume that everybody else has done it and got it right. And I think that that's one of the challenges that we face, is to make sure that people will gather evidence about what they think is important in science. I mean, you can make your own evidence. Medieval witch hunters did that all the time. They were really good at finding out and defining what made somebody a witch and then finding it on them. And then, of course, that was the unfortunate conclusion that they were then usually ostracized from society. And if they were lucky, that was all that happened to them. So I think that it's really a matter of this evidence base. You've got to get good, accurate evidence so that you can make real decisions about things. So what are some of the challenges that we face in relation to science and health right at the moment? Well, obviously, one of them right at the moment is COVID. We think we've got it under control, but we haven't. And we still have long COVID to deal with, and there's this very significant problem there to face. And there's lack of enthusiasm for doing further research in the area, because we have vaccines which are quite effective, but they're not completely effective, and we still need to work to get better ones. It's not helped by the fact that half the politics in America is about the fact that they don't believe that the COVID vaccine has anything to do with health anymore. Another area which I personally think is really important that we need to put more time into is understanding the basis of psychiatric disorders. We have a very considerable range of psychiatric disorders to deal with that we really have not got solutions to. I mean, we people in psychiatric hospitals because they are safer there than being out in the world at large, but that does not mean that we've done anything useful to cure their problem, and that we accept that there's probably a genetic component to these things. We accept there's probably environmental associations as well. But the amount of study that's being done on these diseases is minimal in comparison with the impact that they're having on societies globally. And we really need to do a little better than that. So that's one area of challenge where there's a health problem that we haven't got solutions to, at least in my opinion. And then we've got the problems where we've got people who would deny conventional scientific wisdom, and thinking of no particular US presidents, we do have this problem that there are people who are going out there and saying that vaccines are not only not effective, that they're also damaging. And this really can only be sorted out by conventional scientific approaches, experimental science. You find out the answers. Plus, there has to be a rational explanation behind it. I mean, at the end of the day, we know enough about physiology and pathophysiology now that we should be able to rationalize anything that we're trying to deal with in relation to disease, virus or otherwise. But the biggest problem we actually have in science is not is not the health problem itself or the way that people have denied the significance of it, but rather the practical operational challenges of finding enough resources, finding enough scientists, and finding our ability to communicate effectively to the public better than we have been doing in the past. Because people obviously believe the story that they've heard most recently, and I think it's very obvious, at least to me, that the challenges that we face with health problems in the future are in large measure because people don't really see it's essential that we get on and do some more research in these areas. It costs money, it's true, and it's important to recognize that we should be trying to prioritize issues. But I think the important thing is to understand that there is a scientific basis to health control, and we need to make sure that people are getting on and doing that. I think one of the problems that we face is separating truth from fiction science. You know, it's we can see that there are definitions of science which basically define about a body of knowledge. You know, okay, this is how things are, but it doesn't say much about evidence testing the knowledge that we have already. And if we don't have the ability to do that, then we lose out as a consequence. I think that this business of scientific proof. You know, we have to accept that we have times when the word science in relation to a statement will be inappropriate. So the important thing is to make sure that we have evidence-based science, but also we don't allow other people to apply the word science to things which are not scientific, because that's where the real challenge lies. It's very easy for people to say something is in one particular way correct or wrong without evidence to support it. Think, for example, about the time and effort necessary to introduce the concept that planets went round the sun rather than the sun going round the planets in the 16th and 17th century. So heliocentricity was a challenge for many hundreds of years. And again, you've got to start thinking the right way in order to solve these problems. So the misuse of science is one of the things which we have to be very careful to avoid. Scientific truth is often not about absolute statements. It's relative. We think it might work this way. Our best estimate of truth at the moment is this. And because we are a good scientist and because we say that, people then get concerned and say, okay, well, you don't really know the answer. And therefore, we have to try and understand that we have to have reliable science by independent observations repeatedly confirmed by lots of different people. And eventually the truth will come out. But even then, even the scientific community tries to shy away from the notion of absolute truths. It's an uncomfortable thing to say that this is absolutely the way that the world works. I mean, we kind of know gravity works, but we kind of don't know why it works. I mean, we're very good at making stories up about that, and of course, the practical observation is proof of the pudding to some extent. But we also have to recognise that there's still work to be done in that area. If we really want to persuade people that we understand things, I mean, we can spend a lot of time talking about the scientific process and how we can try and get a better answer for these difficult problems. But at the end of the day, the only way we can do it is through experimental research and a better understanding of how things work. And this comes back to this business of truth and science. What I was actually asked to speak about is that we need to understand the concept of truth and science is not absolute, it's relative. We know this much, and we can do more, and we can continue to invest in doing research to answer questions. So there's a misuse of science in relation to health, in my opinion. I have to be quite honest about that. There are a lot of sensational claims made with very little evidence to support them. Leaders seem to think that way, but it's a control mechanism. They're just, trust me, I know what I'm talking about, and scientists don't. And then they can afford to get rid of the scientists. So it's a control mechanism for cutting expense, in my opinion, particularly in the US. And we really need to fight against that with governments all the time. We're very fortunate in Australia. We have a government, we have had a series of governments that believe enough in scientific research to keep increasing the amount of money that they're putting into research. Not fast enough, in my opinion, but at least they are doing it. And they do that because there have been a number of reports over years. The Wills report was probably the first one in 2005, and then one every 5 years thereafter, which have argued very strongly for the benefit of the research money that's already been spent and the potential for future gain if more money is put in. And these reports are unfortunately usually buried. You get given to government. The last one which I was involved with was basically funded by a Labour government. The report was produced in the dying weeks of that Labour government. There was a Conservative government replaced it, and the report was effectively ignored. Now, that's how I see it, I must stress. And it's not a particularly scientific story, but that's how it looks. Having said that, nevertheless, there has been a steady increase in funding for health and medical research in this country since then. And over the last 20 years, I think that the amount of money that's available has nearly doubled, which is pretty impressive. So we have to try and persuade our governments that there is a concept of truth in science, that it comes out through doing research, and that it benefits the community. On the other, we have to also acknowledge that we get it wrong sometimes. I mean, the example which I will quote is one which you're probably familiar with. There is Dr. Andrew Wakefield, and he came up with this observation that he believed that the enterocolitis with a virus, infection of your gut with a virus, and subsequently with a vaccine designed to prevent that virus, contributed to the development of autism, which I presume most of you understand as a disease where children particularly seem unable to fit normally into society, albeit they generally are relatively healthy other than that. And Dr. Wakefield spent a lot of time starting with a good scientific approach, but subsequently he just decided that this was the answer, and he argued very strongly that the MMR vaccine should not be given because of the risk that it might cause autism. Fortunately, that's no longer accepted, but it does point out the sort of problems that we have to face. I think that these are examples of where we have problems that we have to sort out. We've really got to work hard on both the business of making only sensible claims about what science can and can't do, and then making sure that other people don't make sensational claims which aren't well backed by evidence. So that I think that in the interests of time, I'll probably stop at that point, although there's a few other points that I would really like to make, more about other scientists, the sciences that I haven't actually covered. But I think the most important thing that we realize is that there is never absolute truth in science. There is relative truth. We can do experiments which will convince ourselves that this is the way the system works. And that continues until somebody else does an experiment which shows that it's wrong. In some way, maybe just a little bit, but nevertheless, it changes the paradigm. And that's why scientific research is really important, and why we actually have to ensure that we carry on doing it, even in areas where we think we understand what we're doing, because we can't really cope with this concept that science is rigidly and absolutely correct, because it isn't. We don't have all the answers, and we probably never will have, at least for some of the issues that we can't solve. So I think the real message that I would leave you with is let's invest in science. Let's make sure we do the best we can to find out what the answers are. But we also have to be a little bit careful. I mean, vaccine technology is one area where people get very sensitive about, and that we had good flu vaccines that were made in eggs. CSL consumed about half the production of hen eggs every year in order to make the flu vaccine for Australia. We can make vaccine technology which doesn't involve fly virus put into eggs using modified animal genetic material. The question really is, if the modified genetic material works and the eggs work, when the eggs are cheaper, should we just be using eggs? I mean, it's a debate that we have to have. At some point, we have to decide these things, because it's not just about getting the science right, it's getting the science right at a practical level for the people that need to use it. So we are left with this whole question of science as a storytelling exercise. We recognize we can't explain everything we see. Not everyone believes the dominant paradigms that we currently accept in science, and our attempts to define the rules better only become validated through the prediction of what will happen next. Post hoc, looking backwards, is not as effective as looking forwards and testing the concept at a real level. And we really need to make sure that we get this sort of information out to our children and to our students, and we don't really want to see more of this. With the problem of measles returning in the United States now, the disease that was gone in the United States has now returned because there are so many people not being vaccinated against measles now. And that's the passionate issue that I would like to see more done about, because I'm a vaccinologist and I like thinking that vaccines work, but I really recognize that we must use the ones we've got once we know they work. And I'll stop at that point, and thank you very much for your attention.
The weather in Aberdeen was probably also a factor in the decision to come to the Southern Hemisphere, I suspect. Thank you very much. I'd like now to introduce Nick Enfield, Professor Nick Enfield, who's going to facilitate the Q&A. Nick is Professor of Linguistics and Director of the University of Sydney Social Sciences and Humanities Advanced Research Centre. Nick is a wonderful friend, many friends that we have at the University of Sydney. He's Professor of Linguistics and Director of the Centre, as I said. He is Head of Research Excellence Initiative and the Crisis of Post-Truth Discourse. And so you can see where we're going with this. Nick has had extensive experience and made extensive contributions to the debate around how we communicate complex issues in science. How do we address these issues of the absence of absolute truths, but yet preserve the primacy of the empirical evidence, the tests, the double-blind clinical trials, etc. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, and thank you for welcoming Nick Enfield.
Well, thanks very much, and thanks to you, Ian, for a great talk. And it's just incredible to hear from somebody who's made such incredible achievements in science. I want to start. You were just emphasizing that absolute truth is not what science goes for. So let's accept that. But I want to push you a bit on that and ask about, and maybe another way to put it would be something like deep truth, or some kind of deep insight. So you mentioned at the beginning of the talk the three-body problem and these kinds of, you mentioned heliocentricity and these issues about gravity and so forth. And it made me think of our understanding of how the tides work. So this is a kind of, an ancient phenomenon that anybody who lives by the sea can observe the tides coming in and going out. And we know that people in, let's say, traditional cultures, indigenous groups and so forth, have actually really quite subtle and deep understanding of how the tides work, in the sense that they can predict when the tide's going to be especially high. They can track the relationship to the moon's phases. They can track the relationship to the size of the moon in the sky. So all of that knowledge enters into people's predictions about whether today is going to be a good day to go fishing, and other kinds of insights. So you can get a very deep working understanding of a kind of causal system in that type of context, but without understanding necessarily that what the moon and the earth and the sun are doing relative to each other in relation to celestial movement, gravitational impacts, and so forth. So the question I want to ask is, if you think about people's deep understanding, how do you draw the line between that kind of an understanding, which might be motivated or described by mythological characters and so forth, but still real knowledge? How do you square that with what you think about as science in that kind of deeper, longer term sense?
Yeah, that's a very important question to address, actually. I mean, science is, at one level, a pragmatic and practical tool to get things done. And the example of the tides is a very practical one, because people were well aware of the tides long before they thought very much about gravity. On the other hand, we still would like to understand more about it, and that can be quite useful. The extra knowledge can allow you to predict when something that you weren't expecting happened. And if a large asteroid body came through the solar system unexpectedly, then we would want to know what the impact of that would be in advance. We would want to use our practical knowledge of science in depth, rather than just wait to see whether the moon went, whether the tides came in a particular way. So the two are very important. The one is the pragmatic working science, which is the cowpox, smallpox story, if you think about it. I mean, it wasn't scientific proof of anything. It was just an observation, but a very important one. And then the other one is the deep understanding that you hope will allow you to go further with what you're doing and make more use of it. I mean, I'm still, totally puzzled by gravity. I mean, the gravity is something that acts at a distance, and you have to think, okay, well, what's actually acting at a distance, and what is it? And well, yes, there are answers to that in the literature, which are theoretical, and they don't stop us making good use of gravity. They don't stop us thinking about how it actually impacts on what we're doing. It can become very important when minute alterations in the way that the force of gravity actually works on an object can make a very big difference to whether your plane lands in the right place or not. So you have to accept that both are necessary.
Right. So do you think, I mean, there's this term pure science that we sometimes hear applied, blue sky research, these kinds of ideas that are often contrasted against very specific problem kind of oriented science. Do you think that there's something there between, an approach to solving a very specific problem, like landing a plane or what have you, as opposed to trying to just understand purely for understanding's sake? Is that the key piece?
Look, it's interesting that one example which has come to light recently is this whole business of particles being sent out from the sun, and one particular particle wasn't appearing as much as it was thought it should do, and that was going to knock a whole theory of physics to bits. But what it turned out was that there was just the wrong test to apply. By the particles that were coming from the sun as one thing were actually decaying to become something else before they reached the detectors on the moon. And that the reason that these particles were missing was not because their theory was wrong, but because in practice there was another bit to the theory, that these particles decay and they're not where you were expecting them to be. So that's a very non-useful bit of science in a sense, but it's a very important one because it allows you to accept that the results that you're getting are right, and therefore the science behind it is correct.
So it's a good example of the idea of self-correction, I suppose. So you didn't use that term, but you certainly were implying and talking about the idea that there's a humility to science. And people should be able to self-correct, should be keen to self-correct. And so I was fascinated with this tension between that view of sort of self-correction, humility, kind of a commitment to never quite being sure, on the one hand, but on the other hand, the kind of role of a scientist as an authority in some sense socially. Obviously we turn to scientists, we turn to people who have scientific training for guidance, for advice. And so there's this tension there, and I wonder what you've got to say about it. So what I'm talking about is how I think you kind of mentioned this a little in your remarks, that if you emphasize that a scientist never really knows, then you make yourself vulnerable to this kind of let's say the keyboard warrior or many other sort of related types of people who want to say, well, there you go, see, you can't tell me that what you're saying is really true. So what's the way to kind of defend against that stance that says, that it's a weakness of science that you never can say that you're sure?
Yeah, we have relative science and we have absolute observations. And science is only useful as a tool if it predicts what's happening. Conversely, if we want to predict what's happening, we have to use science as the tools to find out. So it works both ways round. People use physics as the example because it's sort of clean. Biology is messy, but it's still practical to use the tools that we have in science to give us a near enough approximation to what will allow us to make the right decision and what to do in a particular situation.
Wow. And
accept that we still may not have all the answers there are to have, and I'm sure that's true. We like to think we know what we're doing, but even in relatively straightforward model systems, we don't always get it right.
Well, I think one of the things you mentioned that was really important in this regard, I think, is that scientists are part of a culture that in which you open yourself up to being challenged by many of your own colleagues, and so there's a sense in which we're all part of this mission in some sense, and we agree to hold each other accountable to each other. So I guess what I'd like to see in that discussion is emphasis of that teamwork and that kind of sense in which you've had multiple attempts to falsify some kind of claim and you failed to do so, whereas I think the average skeptic, shall we say, is often a loner.
Yeah, I think that's part of the problem. But science is a team effort. Even if you don't actually work hand in glove with the person doing the work, you will be reading their papers, and if you don't like what you see, you'll almost certainly be testing what they've done to see if you can reproduce it. And that reproduction part is really important at a practical level. The reason that we publish scientific papers is not just to record that we did something, but to explain exactly what we did to somebody else so that we can copy it and see if it's right. And that's why the actual documentation of how the work was done, where it was done, and how many times it has been done by how many people becomes really important when there's something where there's an issue which really matters. If it's a relatively trivial problem, you don't want to waste the resources on it. If it's a relatively important one, then you want to make sure you got it right.
Yeah.
And the way we do that is by letting independent individuals repeat the work, and preferably in different ways, but testing the same general hypothesis. And we're pretty good at doing that by and large. One of the challenges is we never have all the variables. You've got your brand new vaccine, which is going to be really good against disease X. And unless you immunize everybody on the planet with that, you don't know how many people are going to have a bad reaction to that vaccine. You might find that it's only but they only get a bad reaction if they've also eaten shellfish the day before. Something really abstruse like that. So you have to accept that there's only relative boundaries you can put around the accuracy of the observation. Good scientists will try and think for themselves what might be the things that don't actually make it apply.
So you raised a kind of here's another tension, I think, between, so let's say we want to value the teamwork in science and the idea that we're part of a kind of mission, and we want to open ourselves to being having our minds changed. But at the same time, you mentioned people like Wakefield who had come to a conclusion about the effects of vaccines and then basically stuck to that, and have presumably copped a lot of flack over the years, but also some sort of support. Question I want to raise here is, what about that tension between the bias of the individual and the kind of team? And what I'm getting at here is the idea that, scientists as individuals are, at the same time as being part of a team and a mission in some sense, we're also on a salary, we have a career, we enjoy being invited to conferences and there's a sense of ambition and career building, which you can do that in different kinds of ways, but one of those ways is to really sort of staunchly defend your position rather than trying to self-correct, as it were. So, do you see this as a problem that you've got, let's say, competing incentives in a way? So in science, one incentive is the theory, the principles of knowledge. The other is the kind of sociological side, let's say, or the personal side, the kind of side of living your life as a scientist. So how would you like to see that being resolved?
Well, I mean, first of all, the whole business of educating somebody to become a potential scientist and do research, if you like, is built around the idea that the primary purpose of research is to get it right. It's not to make a name for yourself or to make money or whatever. It may solve a practical problem, but whatever else you want to do, the whole concept of the way we educate scientists is around, let's see if this is reproducible, let's see if some other lab can do it, let's swap reagents and see if we can get somebody else to do use the same material to do the same thing in a different place. And yes, it's not perfect. It will never be perfect, because there will always be the possibility that you've missed a variable completely. That the humidity of the air in a particular laboratory means that something will happen which would not happen in an area where the air was not so humid. It's all these variables that you don't think about that are the challenging ones. But if something looks really wrong, in other words, two things look different when you'd expect they should be the same, then you put a lot of effort into trying to find out why that is, not least because you don't want to make a fool of yourself by publishing a paper which is wrong and having to retract it because somebody else has come along and say, hey, but you didn't do that. We're fortunate that we have the luxury nowadays of having a lot of scientists doing a lot of, not working in similar areas, particularly in areas where there are important problems to solve. That wasn't the case in the 17th and 18th century, where there'd be one sole person doing it and then making their mind up what the answer was. But amazingly, they got it right pretty often. The testimony to that is if you just look through the annals of the Academy of Science and the reports that they wrote in the 18th century about things, and most of them are pretty much accurate. They didn't get corrected by anybody. It was a single scientist doing the work, but the stories came out mostly right. And I think it's a mindset thing. There's no point in doing science if you don't get it right.
Right.
So you rely on the fact that we strive for perfection. Artists try to get the best picture that they possibly can, and journalists try to get the most accurate story. Any journalists in the room? Well, I won't. There will be some, I'm sure. Mostly journalists want to get the story right. They'll correct themselves if they get it wrong. You get a little apologia the next day and say, sorry, we didn't quite get that right. And in science, we do that too. We'll write and say, you sometimes have to write it in such a way as it's a polite pointer to the fact that it's not quite right. But you can say, look, this seems to contrast with the results of somebody else's previous work. And then you take it from there to try and resolve the issue, hopefully by collaboration.
So what about the question of communicating all of this? So you've mentioned a couple of times, used the word story a few times and storytelling, particularly towards the end. And this is always a challenge, of course, as scientists, we we learn the method, we learn the culture, we learn the mindset. But then there's this whole field of kind of outreach and communication of the science. So clearly, obviously I guess there's just publicity, but there's also, of course, actually trying to get uptake. So in the case of vaccination, you want to get the public understanding what's going on and uptake there. So oftentimes there's an idea that storytelling is a good thing from this point of view, and because we know that humans respond to story, we're naturally kind of engaged by story, and science can be very dry for some people. And I think also importantly, when we publish a scientific study, oftentimes the narrative is kind of, well, you leave a lot of stuff out that didn't go the way you thought, right? You don't tell every detail of how you got from the beginning to the end. So there's a little bit of, when storytelling sometimes means that you're skipping over certain details, it necessarily means you're simplifying things. So a question I want to ask is when is storytelling advisable? When I've discussed this with some scientists, some people are like, I don't like the idea of storytelling about science because because of exactly what I've just described, where you're leaving information out. So do you see that as a problem, as a tension, or how do you navigate?
It depends what you're trying to achieve by the storytelling. If the aim is to reduce something to a level where the community that you really want to tell the story to can understand it, I think that's acceptable storytelling. And you can put any number of caveats on that after the event if need be. If the aim in storytelling is to tell the wrong story for some reason rather, well, and people will do that for all sorts of reasons. They will use pseudoscience to make a story. Then that obviously has to correct itself one way or another. And I think that we're fortunate that for things that matter, there are going to be 10 people trying to chase up every story for every one that's produced if it just doesn't sound right.
Yeah, I mean, the problem, I guess, is that it's if a story is told well, if you have a charismatic teller, if the story is one that kind of fits with what people want to hear, then no matter how much fact check you do. So you mentioned the current situation in US politics. You have stories being told that are getting lots of traction. And it's very hard to sort of push against those.
Look, the example of that I quote from time to time is the whole business of the shaman telling his followers that if you don't do this, then I'm going to make the sun go away tomorrow. Okay? And they don't do what they're told, and indeed the sun goes away. There is an eclipse. The shaman knows what to do. He knows that if the moon appears immediately above the sun at sunset the day before, there is a very high chance that there will be an eclipse of the sun the following day. So he can get off with that, but he's storytelling his troops, if you like, that he wants them to do something, and if you don't do it, I'll make the sun go away. So, that's a different sort of storytelling, but it is a storytelling system. Now, the shaman didn't know exactly what that was all about either, but he just knew that one bit of science was relatively reproducible.
Right. So in a moment, we're going to open up to audience questions. We have time to take questions, so formulate your questions, and we'll come to you in a moment with your questions for Ian. But let me just, as you're cogitating, let me finish with one more question that I wanted to discuss. So you ended on education, and that's something that we've kind of been starting to touch on. And I certainly agree with you that it's really the key is to try to cultivate a kind of mindset among young people in particular, where they're going to be amenable to that kind of culture, that scientific mindset. But there's a lot of pieces to it that are it's quite a tall order, right? So we really want people to have more kind of probabilistic thinking rather than kind of categorical thinking. We want people to be thinking long term rather than short term. We want people to be self-correcting rather than self-defending. So these things, they've got to get a lot of things right in a certain sense. This is not the easiest question to answer, but what do you think we can do really to get the education right such that, we'll have enough of the people with the right kind of mindset, that the scientific kind of, we've got enough people coming through to do good science?
Yeah, it's a challenge. Science is a tough career, and you're always being questioned, and it's not for everyone. So you're quite right. I mean, how do we ensure that we get a sufficiency of people who are actually genuinely interested in getting it right? Because that's really what it comes down to. You can do science and you can generate a lot of data, and it doesn't mean very much. Don't take that too much for heart, but that's the reality, is that quite a large part of the science that goes on in the area that I work in collects data sets, but the data sets are not immediately apparently useful. That doesn't mean they won't be in the future for some purpose or whatever. But if the data sets don't answer a question that was set to generate the data sets, then they're probably not going to be terribly useful. So I think that the key to all of this is, in fact, to make sure that people ask meaningful questions. And it's this whole business of what is a meaningful question that is worth talking about. It may be a practical problem that makes a question meaningful, or it may be because we just don't know something that we really want to try and establish what's actually happening. But either way around, whether it's because there's a practical problem or because we just need to know more about something, then the art with that is to be able to put it into words, if you like, and say, look, this is what we really want to know the answer to. And while you might find all these extra bits around the edges and they'll get published somewhere or forgotten completely, which is quite commonly the case. I think one of the other things that relates to that is that actually we have to make sure that as much as possible data sets that are generated, along with the way they were generated, become public domain. We don't want secrets. It may be necessary for a practical point of view to get something commercialized, but it's kept quiet until there's a patent or whatever. I have that challenge myself. But the whole idea of making sure that all data sets end up in the public domain, along with the way they were generated, is really important. If you're not prepared to do that, you're wasting the money and the time. That somebody else might go and do exactly the same thing for exactly the same reason as you did it, but they didn't know you did it, so they're going to repeat it again and presumably get a similar data set. And that can happen multiple times if we don't make it clear what we're doing. It's still hard enough. One of the problems at the moment is that the literature is huge. Yeah. And it's not printed anymore, it's all electronic. That doesn't solve the problem. And we've still got this challenge of the sheer volume of data that are generated through work that's done, certainly in the biosciences, I presume, and the physical sciences as well. You can't, and the other thing, of course, is that you can't put all the variables in. If you're hoping to manage a particular health problem, there are so many other variables round about that health problem that you can't account for all of them in saying what you did and how you did it. You can only say, well, I took 10 people with this disease and I did X for them, and 9 out of the 10 got better. And you think, okay, well, why didn't that other one get better? Well, we don't know enough information to answer that question. So it is really a case of collecting data and making it available and thinking carefully about how else it might be used and how often it needs to be repeated. Because we rely very much on the fact that we verify our data sets by getting someone else to do exactly the same thing.
Great. So I'd like to open it up, but let me just first emphasize, so I'm sure there's a number of people who'd like to ask a question. We certainly want to hear a number of different voices in asking Ian questions. So could you please keep your questions brief, just get straight into the question. Maybe start in the back on the left.
Hi, Ian. My name's Lucy. Thank you for the incredible contribution to women's health that you've made. I have a question which is actually a thought experiment, if you wouldn't mind humoring me. If we had another pandemic in 5 years' time and you happen to be the Prime Minister of Australia, how would you manage communication of the vaccine?
Sorry, which vaccine were we talking about?
Vaccination for this future virus that we were trying to encourage people to take up.
Oh, right. Some theoretical virus.
Theoretical, hypothetical.
Yeah.
A hypothetical.
Yes. Well, I mean, obviously, it depends on the nature of the problem, how you're going to get that solved. I mean, if it's something like COVID was, where where there was obviously a problem with an infection, and we needed to find out how to control it. The interesting thing is that we actually went about it the right way, and everybody complained bitterly that we had done what we did, because we said, okay, look, seems to be infectious. Let's isolate people. Let's stop moving them around, and let's see if that works. And it did. It's that sort of level that you can do things at. But you can't guarantee there will be a solution. But what you can do is you can put resources into trying to solve it. And when COVID came along, a huge shift occurred in where the effort was going into health and medical research funding towards promoting the development of a better understanding of COVID and a better understanding of how it might be controlled. So the system is very flexible, so long as you've got trained scientists. And the trained scientists jump at the opportunity of getting involved in something like that. But the question really comes back to another issue: is has anybody the right to legislate to control the spread of an infection? And the answer is yes, absolutely, under some circumstances. I mean, one of the ways that smallpox was eventually eradicated from at least the UK population was that you had to demonstrate before you registered the birth of your child that they had been vaccinated against smallpox. And if you did not get them vaccinated, then they didn't get registered, and therefore they didn't exist, at least on paper. And that carried on for a good number of years in the latter half of the 19th century, until smallpox was eradicated at a practical level in the UK. So, I think governments do intervene, but they tend to intervene fairly drastically in order to achieve a particular result.
I have a question in the middle, the white shirt.
Yes, good evening. I think the University of Sydney has bumped up medicine to the ranking of science, because it came up with an acronym STEM with double M. And then I read scholarly articles that try to present medicine as an art of interpretation. When I read some articles on neuroscience, for instance, with the neurons that came out in 2013, there's been a series of scholars trying to debunk that theory, and so they had to replicate it, and then there's still people coming back and trying to debunk that. So my question is interpretation the enemy of science, or because interpretation is also the art of the humanities?
That's an interesting question. I think interpretation is an art in itself. There are rules about how you can interpret data, and that's what I think you're asking: is how do you validate the interpretation of a data set? Again, it could become self-correcting if more than one looks at the same, even looking at the same data set, for example, but even better if they're looking at a completely different data set around the same problem. Reproducibility is at the heart of defining what we understand as what is the scientific logic of what we're looking at. And we're not perfect at it. I mean, particularly not with human disease, because we're in Australia, some 22 million different experiments all the time. We're genetically different one from another, apart from identical twins. even there are heritable differences. And so you're going to get variability for sure. What you want to know is what mass action effect is, what will happen if we do this, then will 90% of people get this outcome, or will 5%? And that's the bit where you have to actually do the statistics, if you like. You cannot predict it. We don't understand enough about how the human body works to be able to answer a question from a priori basis of the knowledge of human biology plus the thing that we're doing to intervene. We can have a guess, and often we do. If we understand roughly how vaccines work, we can roughly work out that if we use the vaccine this way, then you'll get an antibody which will stop the infection. But there are a whole range of other things where it's far less clear that this will be a generally applicable outcome for a particular intervention. And I think that's one of the things that scientists realize, but the newspapers don't.
Okay, there's a question on me.
Thanks very much, Ian. I'd like to follow up the issue of science education and the level of general awareness about science in the general community, scientific literacy, if you like. Mm-hmm. There's so much rubbish that gets accepted by a large segment of the community, partly, I guess, because of a lack of any awareness of basic science and a lack of healthy skepticism that scientists all should have. Is there any pressure or any thought about trying to address this?
You mean compulsory education in science? No, I don't think we want to do that, really. I mean, that will create more problems than it solves. I think that it would be nice to have a scientifically literate community that understand not necessarily all the details of everything, but just the general concept of repeated observations tend to lead to answers which are meaningful. And people who falsify results will probably create problems. And if we get it at that sort of level, then I think that that's probably the best we can really hope for. People who are interested, I mean, the one thing that I would comment on is that there are some people who are so ultra interested in science that they are probably not as reliable as they should be. If they've already made their mind up what the answer is before they've done the experiment, there's a problem. And yet, funnily enough, we always do that, because whenever we're writing an application to do the science, we write down exactly what we're going to do. And therefore, we've kind of decided what the answer is going to be. But then we get surprises from time to time, and a good scientist recognizes when there's been a surprise. I mean, we don't want to do safe science, if you know what I mean. It's something which is so predictable that it wasn't worth the bothering doing. But we do want to do repetitions of things which look like we know the answer sufficiently that we can be confident that we got it right. So there's this tension between not doing safe science. You don't want to just do safe science, but you do want to reproduce things which is a sort of safe science, because you kind of expect it's going to work the second time, but you've got to actually show that. And fortunately, we seem to manage that pretty well. It's harder if you're a nuclear physicist. Taking over CERN for a couple of weeks to answer a particular problem is expensive. Trying to do it twice is twice as expensive, and somebody's got to pay. But for biological sciences, I think it's by and large relatively simple to make it a one go and then another go type approach, rather than trying to get it perfect the first time.
And
on the subject of truth in science, I see there are two different types. In fact, I think there's two different types of science. There's empirical, experiential science, and medicine would be one of those. And then there's also the abstract, theoretical, sort of understanding kind of science. And I think truth is different in the two halves. In the empirical science, you do an experiment over and over and over again, eventually show that this is a regularity that is true, that you can rely on. And it's valuable to do that. But I wonder, in the terms of education, I wonder if what we don't have to, if we shouldn't in fact try and teach people not only just to do things over and over again and find a regularity, but also to understand how it might work and what might be going on and what to do. Now, truth in that area is about understanding rather than just observation. And to formulate techniques for that understanding those understandings are not a scientific question. They're a metaphysical question. So, and I think that's what's missing out of STEM. We do the S, T, E, and M, and what's missing is the understanding, the metaphysics, the critical thinking, the glues, S, T, E, and M together to make science scientific. Now, my question, and it has to be a question at the end of it, is one of the problems we have is that we're not actually teaching metaphysics. We're not teaching critical thinking. We're not teaching people to think in as much as we are teaching them practically to just keep doing more science and you'll get the answer. So how can we improve our education system? How might we go about teaching the next generation to be scientific literate, as the previous person said, but also to be better analytical thinkers and better critical thinkers and get them to understand what they're doing rather than just doing it?
Thank you.
It's a fair question, and I don't have an easy answer for you in that. I mean, the sort of thing that that applies to is this whole business of what gravity is all about, for example.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, because you can see gravity, it happens, no arguments about that. But to conceive how it might actually work, because it's certainly not self-evident how it works, requires a different sort of thinking.
Hard. I think we have to think harder, I think, is the answer. Over here, this question.
Hi, thanks. I'm gonna play devil's advocate for a minute and push back on something that you said a few minutes ago about science's sort of self-correction and replication. 2005, Ioannidis publishes, half of all scientific findings are wrong. Center for Open Science runs big reproducibility studies in psychology, cancer biology gets similar numbers. And I guess I've been a little bit missing the conversation here about the reproducibility crisis that's been going on. And I'm coming at this from a critical friend. I've worked in research leadership at Macquarie University, and this is something that an area that I've worked in. But I just wondered what your response or what your feeling about the course of the reproducibility crisis, how successful efforts to overcome that have been, and where you see that going in future.
Yeah, look, it's the whole problem of an N of one experiment. Every person that you put into any sort of study of that sort brings so many variabilities into the system that it's very difficult to define concrete answers from either observational or interventional science. And you're absolutely right. It becomes most obvious when you're dealing with what I would regard as minor mental illness, where you can define that the person is not behaving in what we would regard as the normal way. So there are certain boundaries at the edge here, and they step out over those boundaries. But how you actually then try to work out what's going on there, you can't. It's not going to be reproducible because you don't know all the variables. I mean, if it's a social science issue and you can't account for the fact that this person was educated in Ethiopia and this one over here was educated in Australia, their life experience is going to be so different that if the both of them have severe depression, you're going to find it very difficult to work out why one has and the other hasn't, and whether one treatment will work and another one won't. I mean, that's the bedevilment of the drug companies when it comes to dealing with medications for behavior, is that there's such a wide variability. I mean, think about autistic children. I mean, leaving aside the issues that we addressed earlier in that topic, but just thinking about these kids with autism. I mean, they are all each one an individual experiment, and we don't really have a good understanding of why. So we don't even know where to start with the experiments, if you like. And I think that that's why we tend to use blunt tools to try and solve problems. But you're right, it's an issue we need to address.
Everything we've been talking about has been about discovery, pushing on and on and on discovery, trying to get to the absolute truth, even though you've said there is no absolute truth, which I think is right. And I'm sure along the way, most scientists think they're on to discovering this, but actually they discover that. And that's all very important. It's all part of that human element. I mean, the most famous example of that is penicillin, when someone didn't clean up their laboratory table and they came back from their holidays and there was the mold, there was the penicillin. So what I want to know is, given that human element and all of that, and given we're talking about testability, is AI going to be a help there or not? Would AI have helped us get to penicillin faster, or would it actually have gotten in the way?
It depends how you define AI. I mean, because AI is itself an experiment, and the variables you feed into it give very different outcomes according to what you put in. So I think the short answer is AI as we currently do it. No, I don't think it's going to help solve problems directly. It might be able to draw some boundaries around things a bit, but it's artificial intelligence. I just see it as a random number generator with a certain concerted set of constraints on what numbers are actually generated. So the short answer is AI can be useful if you're paying your tax bill. It'll maximize your return on your time. But I don't see it as going to solve science problems, I'm afraid.
A new data set appears to have come into the media that cancers that once upon a time belonged to older generation are now being found and reported, and they're coming into the 30s, people are in their 30s. And this seemed to create quite a bit of interest on the radio program that something is happening. Where would you see the direction going? So we've got the demography. Where do we go after this?
Well, we probably need to look at the demography a bit more in detail to start with. I mean, because you find breast cancers earlier if you look earlier. That's one of the immediate outcomes of breast cancer screening, was that there was a sudden upsurge in early breast cancers being reported, simply because you now had a tool where you could see them. So that's one sort of issue which we need to think about. The next one, obviously, is there an environmental cause that's increasing a particular cancer one over another? And the answer to that is almost certainly going to turn out to be yes. I mean, our behavior in the sun is a perfectly good example of that. And when slip-slop-slap was being promoted much more vigorously than it is at the moment, the incidence of skin cancer went way down. And now it's coming back up again because people are no longer following the plan and using sunscreen when they should. And the slip-slop-slap program is still there, but it's not nearly as impactful now as it once was, especially not in school kids in the classroom, as far as I can see. So yeah, these changes in the apparent demography of particular diseases. They have to be watched, they have to be followed. You have to test the obvious assumptions, first of all, that you're just better at detecting that particular cancer at an earlier stage than you once were. But if that turns out not to be the case, then you've got to start looking for the other causes. And fortunately, there are reasonably good approaches for doing that, given what we understand about the genesis of cancer. I mean, hepatobiliary cancers have become much more common in certain parts of the world and much less common in other parts because they're being able to get rid of certain parasites in drinking water. So, it's a matter of, you have to go and look for the answer, but the answers will be there if you put the effort in. It's always a matter of how much effort and how much money and how much time can be put onto any particular problem. But I think that we are getting rather better at screening for cancer early because we know we can treat it better when we get it early. Outcome in the long run is better.
On that very, very insightful talk, can you please join me in thanking both of our speakers from this evening?
Yeah.
I have a certain suspicion that the metaphysical probably was more likely to emerge on the slopes of ski slopes in France than in the surgeries at Edinburgh Hospital. I think on that note, though, our benefactor obviously made a huge impact on the healthcare landscape in Australia. Ian's talked about the fact that science, really great science, is a team sport. Behind, I think, the story of Ian's success with HPV are an enormous number of people who have worked collaboratively across the world, continue to work, people working in labs tonight, people working in hospitals. And I think it's important we recognize that enormous contribution. As Ian has said, we have benefited, I think, from bipartisan support for industrial policy around pharmaceutical industry, pharmaceutical scheme, but also the funding of pharmaceutical research and the funding of medical research generally. There's also been enormous philanthropic efforts and contributions, and we'd encourage everybody to make those efforts. It's considered sort of rude to turn up a dinner party and not be, up to date with the latest culture, arts, drama, opera. I think we maybe need to hold ourselves slightly more accountable for our knowledge of science and contemporary science in particular, and perhaps turn our conversations now and again to those issues. I think the reality is that this country's had an amazing track record in attracting some outstanding talent, the contributions we've been able to make. And I think it's rare that we're able to acknowledge somebody like Ian, who's had such an important impact, not just on women's health, but increasingly on young men. And we'd encourage all of you to carry forth his message tonight about science, best efforts, best endeavors, self-correcting. But most importantly, I think his enthusiasm is just infectious. And while he may have doubts about the narrative, I think he's sort of undoing his own argument in terms of the very powerful narrative he's crafted tonight. So thank you again for joining us. And once again, let's thank our speakers. Thank you very much to you, David.